Hi there, I'm Matt Gemmell and I'm here to talk about my KESTREL techno-thrillers series. It's a gorgeous day here in Edinburgh, at least in terms of temperature and being dry. It's a wee bit cloudy, but we will certainly take it. These books, a trilogy so far, have been out for a few years now, with the latest one out just a couple of months ago, I think, a few months ago. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to do some background and some behind the scenes stuff about how these books came to be and about their plots. So what is the Kestrel series? It is a European Union based techno-thrillers series that also deals with weird events and fringe science and slightly fanciful technology, sort of science fiction elements, but very much set in the present day. And it tries to be sort of situated within actual global events, at least as a background as well, and as much as you can within a series of novels. There's an ensemble cast, 5 core characters, which recur constantly, and we're also picking up the occasional reappearing minor character as we go, and as tends to happen with a series. There are 3 books at the moment. The first one, Changer, then there's a second, Toll, and finally the new one that came out just this year, 2024, at the beginning of the year, Jinx. So a lot of the stuff about how the series came about is intimately connected to the first book, Changer. So I'll mostly be talking about that. But I knew that I wanted to have the books very much set in Europe and not in the United States, because there's so much fiction, particularly in the techno-thriller genre, in the English language, that quite naturally is set in the United States and is mostly North American characters. And I didn't want to sort of try and write in an area that didn't reflect my own background, or to add to a genre that already has a strong association with particular places and nationalities and so on. There are so many stories, because of the wide reach of US media, that don't tend to be told in other locations. And being a Scotsman myself, very much a European, I wanted to make use of some of our fabulous locations, incredible architecture, obviously vast history, and the exoticness and intrigue and so on that comes from that, but placed in the modern world. There tends to be this strange false distinction between historical stuff and Europe, etc., and contemporary stuff and North America. And it is a false distinction. And it was just so exciting and interesting for me to work in this genre, but here in Europe. So a few words about just the series and the genre in general before I get on to Changer to begin with. Techno-thrillers are a research-heavy genre. People who read techno-thrillers tend to expect a certain level of correctness if you're dealing with stuff that does exist or is factual, or at least plausibility or consistency or some mixture of those if you're dealing with more fanciful stuff. And there are two main areas in which that comes out. The first is weapons, firearms and so on. People over here, firearms are not a part of our daily experience, but they're very much part of that genre, and they do have roles in action and intrigue and so on. And people who read techno-thrillers, I have found, tend to get quite upset if you make egregious, from their perspective, errors with gun stuff. So I found myself repeatedly in the position of having to very carefully research that area of things in order to make sure that things were at least plausible, if not always absolutely 100% accurate. The other thing with techno-thrillers is that, not by necessity, but by convention, they tend to have that, I suppose, that James Bond kind of globe-trotting, multi-location, multi-country thing, which places this additional burden, if you want to do it properly, of keeping track of times and places and time zones and journey times and all that sort of stuff. So going to fly from one place, it has to take a certain amount of time to get to another place, and it has to be a certain time of day when they get there, and you've got to sort of keep tabs and have a timeline. The more fast-paced the action is, and the more scene changes and location changes you have, the more breathless the pace, which is something that's obviously very associated with techno-thrillers. The more careful work is required up ahead to keep everything in order and happening at the right times, which can be a challenge, but it's just part of writing in that genre. However, I would moderate that by saying that research, I have found, should always serve the narrative. It shouldn't dictate the story. You can absolutely bend things, ignore things, present things in such a way, maybe with deliberate omission, maybe with exaggeration or whatever it is, such that the plot works and the story, because that's what we care about most, rather than a slavish obedience to even physics and the realities of travel and all that sort of stuff. I also find that one thing that techno-thrillers can lack in their pursuit of this constant breathless pace, of course, is a realistic reflection of downtime and pauses to think and to regroup and to plan and to rest and all that sort of stuff. I've read many techno-thrillers where it's just bam, 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 bam. It's a very sort of percussive pace of truncated chapters, and you get through it quickly, but it can, in my opinion, come out a little over-accelerated, a little stressful and a bit artificial. So what I like to do is sort of have a sine wave-like quality whereby you've got the action and the pace and the excitement and the stakes, but you've also got these down periods of reaction, reflection, contemplation, planning, and of course character development and relationship development. And these books try to do a fair bit of both of those things in a good balance. At least I hope they do. So the first book, Changer, here we go. Let's read the blurb. Destiny can be changed. Denmark, a billionaire industrialist seizes control of a top secret project that the European Defence Agency calls Destiny, manipulating it for his own ends. Scotland. Physicist Neil Aldridge's life is saved by an elite EU Special Forces team codenamed KESTREL, drawing him into a race against time to prevent a disaster that will claim millions of lives. As the chase leads to London, Amsterdam and beyond, Aldridge and his allies must battle a ruthless adversary, a trained killer with an unnatural ability who seeks to hasten the cataclysm. With time running out, Aldridge discovers that he and his enemy share an astonishing secret which may be the key to salvation or cause death on an unprecedented scale. Bom, bom, bom. I remember drafting and redrafting that blurb. I hate writing blurbs in the sense of jacket marketing copy. We also use blurb to describe the praise quotes you get on the jacket. You obviously don't write those yourself for your own books. Don't mind writing them for other people, but I hate writing the jacket copy because it's a very unnatural form of writing for me. It feels kind of, it just feels so salesy, which it is and which it has to be. It's not something that I'm hugely comfortable with, and when I wrote the first draft of the jacket blurb, it was much shorter, and one of the people who was sort of proofreading the early copy of the book read that, and he phoned me, thankfully, from France. I was at a train station in the Circumvesuviana railway network that runs around Vesuvius in Italy, and I was waiting on a train with my wife, and he sort of called and said, this, this isn't a good enough blurb. The book deserves better than that. So I holed up on a veranda for a couple of days with strawberries and Nutella and all that stuff, and just, I must have written dozens of drafts of those 4 paragraphs before I settled on this. Writing these blurbs is a real rite of passage for a fiction writer. Maybe some people take to it easily. I certainly did not, but there you go. So Changer, this being the first novel, it's appropriately named because it went through so many changes, vast changes in terms of what it is and the structure of the story and all of that stuff. There will be some spoilers in this video, in these videos, as I talk about these books. If you have read it, and indeed from the blurb that I read out, you know that this character, Neil Aldridge, is a scientist, a physicist. And a big part of it is sort of from his perspective, or certainly his group, him and this elite KESTREL team. He was originally, in the first draft, he wasn't a scientist at all. He was a journalist. He was a journalist in Edinburgh. And in the final book, final version of the book, rather, final version of Changer, as published, he has this relative, actually an uncle, but surrogate father and mentor, who, in the course of the events, he dies. There was a whole other character in that protege role, a female character, who was not in the book very much. She was just there really to allow a transfer of information to Aldridge in the initial draft. I had to get rid of her completely, cut her totally from the plot, because I realised that in order for Aldridge to be useful to KESTREL, to the team, to be integrated into the plot properly, to have a sufficient role, he needed to have knowledge training which was directly relevant and helpful himself. And certainly not to besmirch journalists, but his ability to write snappy copy would not have been of any help in the events of the book. And it allowed me to compress a full character and at least a couple of minor characters into a single one, which also had ongoing possibility. Because that's the other big change. That's not even a pun, I just have to use that word. I mean, it's there were so many changes made in this book. The other big change that came about was that I initially had the awful, what was I thinking, idea that the main purpose of this book was to introduce KESTREL, and Aldridge was just a means to do that, and he wouldn't be continuing on into future books. My vague idea was that each sort of book would be a mission or a big problem or whatever, and it would involve the team, but there would also be some outside character that came in and was involved intimately for the duration and then that was them, you know. And it's an okay idea, but you become attached to characters in a series, hopefully, and that's what drives you to read the other installments. And if you spend a whole book getting familiarity with and becoming emotionally invested in the character, and then that's the end of them, there's less of an attachment to the series. The other problem with that approach, of course, is that not just because of the Scotland connection, Aldridge was very much me and continues to be. He's a huge projection of many parts of my personality, and I just loved him so much. Even when writing the initial version, which got to like 75% of its final length before a massive change of direction and rewrite, redraft, I just wasn't willing to let him go. So those changes had to happen. The female character excised from the final book, who was the protege of this elderly academic mentor chap, she shows up. I cut her from the book, but I sort of kept her around as an idea, and she shows up briefly in a bonus scene. There are bonus scenes that I have that my newsletter subscribers got. I'll put them on the main Kestrel page on my site soon so that everyone can read them, showing where they lie in the chronology of the books. But she does show up as a wee sort of Easter egg for myself, just in a single little extra scene, as I say. How did the basic idea for the book come about? Well, it was the idea was, in so many books and movies and so on, you're trying to avert some terrible potential future happening because of what will happen, because of what will come after if that takes place. And I thought, well, what if you're trying to avert a future happening because of the consequences it had already had? What if the causality was reversed? What if something happened at some point in the future, but the consequences of it came backwards? So you encounter the consequences first. You've obviously got a science fiction element immediately there. And I thought it was an interesting concept, and it just sat around in my head for a few years until I could find some way to put a story together. So that was the vague, high-level, plotty thing that was drifting around. The other thing that prompted it was that where we lived at the time was this little quiet street and this stone wall, and it had openings every so often to let you through into a cycle path network all through Edinburgh, and I would go there often, not just walking about getting to where I wanted to go, but also to walk the dog. And there was this man that I would see sometimes, older gentleman, you know, 60s maybe, tall, really thin, had an academic look about him, you know, shabby but in a university-ish kind of way. Obviously the grey hair and beard and moustache sort of thing, looked like a professor. And he always looked anxious. He had this little red backpack, like just some cheap backpack, like over one shoulder, you know, really small. And he was, I don't know whether he suffered from problems with anxiety or whatever, I don't know. I never spoke to him, never found out who he was. But on the few occasions I saw him, he was anxious about something, like looking round and so on. And for some reason, the juxtaposition, I suppose, of a very academic look, which you would associate with being preoccupied and detached from daily life and so on, but a hyper focus on his immediate surroundings and an anxiety to him, it just stayed with me. And one time when I was walking up into the centre of Edinburgh, I happened upon him again, further from where I usually tended to see him, which was near where I lived. And he was crossing this big hill, like 4 lanes, crossing over and going across and looking back down. And there were obviously vehicles going up and down. There's a black SUV further down. He wasn't looking at it, but I kind of looked from my angle as if he was looking anxiously at this vehicle. And it just, as a writer of fiction, certain things just waken your brain up. You know, you start to see conspiracy and danger and the strange intruding into the mundane. And so that scene happens in the book. The character's name in the book is Taylor. That's his surname. But in the initial draft, I think it was Milner. But I changed that because there's an antagonist character whose surname also begins with M, and in the opening few chapters of the book, as you're introducing the reader to all of the players, it's better not to have 2 characters with names that begin with the same letter if you can avoid it, just as a convenience for helping the reader understand who's who as you go. So there we are. The other huge change that came about in Changer as it was being written and redrafted is that, as I say, Kestrel's got 5 members, and, you know, spoiler, the 5th one is Aldrich. He comes on board as part of the whole happenings by the end of the book. But of those sort of previous, when the book starts, 4 team members, there were actually originally 6. And it just turned out to be too much. It was too many people to keep track of, too many characters to find meaningful tasks for. It just, I think that's a problem when you're still learning how to write a book, as I was at that time. And this is, they're all about sort of 96,000 words, so about a Hobbit in length. They're all pretty close in length to each other. And it's a fair amount of words. It's not like epic fantasy length, you're getting to 120, 100 whatever thousand, but it's longer than a lot of books that you'll find in a lot of very common and popular genres. But even with that amount of word count to play with, it was just too many people. 6 pre-existing core plus 1 new, 7 characters to keep track of and to move around the settings and so on. It just became too much, and it diluted the pace and diluted the story and so on. So there's 2 alternate timeline original members of Kestrel that you never met, or did you? Because actually they were both earmarked for other things once I'd removed them from the initial draft. One has yet to show up. I do know what that character will be doing in a future book in the series, so you'll meet him later, but the other one, if you've read these books, you have actually come across in a very different form. But we'll get to that in a future video. Another interesting thing about Changer is that originally, because Aldridge was being taken back out of it, and because the story does, spoilers, involve time and the flow of causality and manipulation of events, hence the name. The original basic idea is that all this stuff would happen, and at the end of the story, the timeline would be reset. So you would end up back at the beginning without any of the bad stuff having happened, but the core members of Kestrel would know that it had happened, and that would be, you know, the perspective that the reader was along with. But Aldridge, as the sort of innocent person dragged into this, would be back out of the story and wouldn't even know that any of it had happened. And that's cute when you just talk about it straight, just as an idea, but it's frustrating for the reader because it kind of invalidates a lot of the feelings that you've had along the way. So I took that out quick and proper, but there's an Easter egg in the book that gently sort of nudges at least me to recall that that was the case in the alternate timeline where I wrote the book as it originally was. And it's that the first paragraph, it was raining in Edinburgh, blah, 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 is the same at the start of chapter 1 as it is at the start of the epilogue, because previously the epilogue was literally a reset back to the events of chapter 1. So now you know that it's not just a RT technique. If you even notice the paragraph duplication, it's a wee hint to an alternate timeline version of Changer out here in the real world. So there you go. There were other modifications made. The ability that Aldridge has in that book, and indeed his enemy, his antagonist Merrick, it had much more complex mechanics. There were more sort of rules associated with it from a plot perspective. And again, it was just too difficult to juggle. It had too many consequences that got in the way of putting the narrative together. It's when you're planning things out in isolation, it's so easy to get complicated. You think, and I'll have a character for this, and I'll have a character for this. And then you think about abilities or technologies or whatever, and it has to do this and this and this, and it'd be so cool if I could do a bit with that. And that's fine in isolation, but you're not putting together an encyclopedia or something. You're putting together a story which has to have this primary arc and whatever arcs within it, and it has to have pace and balance and character development and peril and, you know, tragedy and resolution and all this sort of stuff. And it's got to be this coherent thing rather than this mishmash. You know, it's better to have something that is smaller in scope and has definite shape and trajectory and its own pace and identity than it is to have something that's hugely broad and ticks all these kind of artificial boxes. And I think that's something that you can only learn by doing it. So Changer was a massively helpful learning experience for me. It was 2 books, really. The one that I tried to write and realised wasn't right, and the one that I ultimately did manage to write because of learning all those lessons the hard way. And I learned them well. I've not had anything like as arduous a process putting a book together since as I did with this one. It's very dear to me, not just because it's purple, my favourite colour, as you can see, and not just because it's my first novel, but because there's a real honesty to it. You know, it's very raw and it's very learn as you go, and I think that all the things I like about it when I reread bits of it myself, as you occasionally have to when you're writing a series to get references and so on, they're parts that are intrinsic to the characters and to the story rather than fixes or modifications made later. I don't think it's technically the most accomplished one, and I don't know if I would say it's my favourite story just in terms of the plot, and I mean that I don't know. I'm not saying it isn't, but it has a certain certain sweetness and an authenticity, and it just is the book that showed me that I could write something of this length, and it could come out the way that it did and be received the way that it has been, which is incredibly positively, for which I'm enduringly, enormously grateful. It just went through so many changes of its own. I mean, this cover was by no means the only prospect for it. I got 3 different ones for the same designer. The designer for the Kestrel series who did all of these is Stuart Batch. That's Stuart with a U-A-R-T and Batch, B-A-C-H-E at Books Covered. And there's a strong identity if you look at these as they are just now, but there was a process to get that identity. And one of the things I'll be doing in this series of videos is showing the alternates for the covers. So you get this one, and I will put up on the screen for you just now the alternates. Let me pull them up here so I can see them whilst I'm talking about them. So yeah, obviously the purple one, which needed a bunch of changes. There was yellow in it, I think, for Kestrel Book 1, and there's some different sizes with my name versus the title. I wonder if I think there were different weights as well, but that particular concept just needed a bunch of tweaks to get to where it is, but the other concepts are quite radically different. There was this one, which I'll put up somewhere, maybe up here above the guitar. This one is, I mean, I love the colours. I love the mono thing and the Kestrel logo, which Stuart designed. I think it's fantastic. I love it so much. It's on everything for the marketing. It's on the covers, it's on the spines, it's on the series page, it's on their uniforms. It crops up in their HQ in the books as well. I just love it so much. I like that being in the background. I like that deep bluey purple that my name is in the lightning, which features in the story. The image, there's a tension about running naturally, but out in the country, it doesn't reflect anything in the book. And I can more imagine that cover being like a inspirational story from someone who suffered terrible misfortune or injury and built themselves back up via athleticism or something. I don't know. There is a bit of a, I don't know, maybe a reachery feel about it. It has something, but it wasn't a Kestrel book. And then there's this one. You can see how definite I was about having purple involved. This more, in a way, suits the idea, just to me, of the team being involved in all of them, but a lone person who's the second centre of the story coming in just for the length of a book. You know, there's a certain isolation about it. It has a strong European feel, maybe just because of that, you know, that oldie worldy arch thing that's going on. I really like the speed distortion-y line things on my name on there. That has a very high-tech Jason Bourne kind of feel about it to me. And it has something. I like it, and I did like it at the time, but it just didn't have the slightly theatrical, it's our world but it's not feel of the final book. This just spoke to me so much, and I particularly love that you just need to sort of ask your mind to switch perspective to tell you whether this guy's running away from the camera or towards the camera. And if you read the whole book, he can either be the protagonist or the antagonist, depending on what way you believe he's running in silhouette there. This the scene on the cover is set in Munich, isn't it? And the building here, which is a cathedral in the book, is actually, I think it's actually in Berlin. Readers have gone to that building and taken photos with the book there in front of the actual building and sent them to me, which is cool as hell. I love that stuff. It's very interesting and very flattering. I've been to Munich, of course, and to many of the other places that are in the book, although I have not in fact been to that church. I will obviously have to go there and get some photos taken, even though it's been some time. But yeah, it's strange to think back on that time of writing Changer just now, and all those things that were so different. I still have scenes that lifted straight out of the original manuscript with these other characters that don't exist in the story now, and with characters that are still in the story but doing very different things and having very different roles. It really does have, as I keep saying, an alternate universe kind of feel. The best thing that Changer did was it sort of set the flavour for the series. It set the idea that the colour of the book is relevant in the story, and that there are sort of two big reveals at certain distances through the story, and establish the personalities and the more importantly the types of people they are, and the idea that there's always an ethical dilemma at the centre of a Kestrel tale. So Changer, yeah, I'm very fond of it. I think I have different primary emotions for each book in the series so far, and for Changer it is that that kind of parental fondness. It just it was a transformative thing for me to write this and read back over it, and it gets out there and people have their reaction, and vast majority of people seem to really like it. It was just so encouraging and validating and all of that stuff. And there's nothing quite like your first book being out and seeing it in the hands of other people to make you feel that you can really do this job, and that you can write another one, and that you wish you'd started sooner, and all these feelings. But Changer will always symbolise that transition in my life, I suppose, between everything that came before software engineering and tech journalism and so on, hence Aldridge originally being the journalist, and becoming a writer. So it's this kind of totem for me, which is why I have one up on the wall back there as well, and just a symbol of that course change of my own. It's very special to me, and if you have read it, I really hope that you enjoyed it. And of course it led us on to the next book in the series, Toll, which is a very different book, had very different challenges and a different process, and it deals with different things and it means different things to me, and that is what we will talk about in the next video. Thank you so much for watching this. If you've got any questions about my process, about these books, or anything related to that, or even anything unrelated to that, I would absolutely love to hear from you. You can contact me via my site or in the comments wherever this is posted. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this. I hope you'll watch the next video too. Thanks.